On September 24th, 2023, a small capsule appeared over the Utah desert. It had just traveled billions of miles through space. Inside were rocks and dust collected from an asteroid named Bennu, material that had remained largely unchanged since the earliest days of the solar system. NASA had spent 7 years sending a spacecraft to Bennu and bringing part of it home. But landing the capsule was only the beginning. Because when scientists finally opened it, they began finding something far more interesting than ordinary space rocks. The story began 7 years earlier. On September 8, 2016, OSIRIS-REx launched from Cape Canaveral aboard an Atlas V rocket. Its target was Bennu, a dark, carbon-rich near-Earth asteroid. NASA wanted something that telescopes could never provide: a pristine sample. Not a meteorite that had burned through Earth's atmosphere and spent years exposed to our environment, but material collected directly from an asteroid and sealed for the journey home. The spacecraft would have to reach Bennu, map it, touch it for only seconds, and survive the trip back. More than 2 years after launch, Bennu finally came into view, and it looked strange. The asteroid was roughly diamond-shaped, covered in enormous boulders and loose debris. OSIRIS-REx photographed Bennu from every direction, creating detailed maps of a world only about half a kilometer across. These were not illustrations. The spacecraft's cameras were actually photographing the surface from space. And as scientists examined the images, one problem became obvious. Bennu was much rougher than they had expected. The original mission assumed finding a flat sampling area would be relatively easy. Bennu changed that plan. Its surface was filled with rocks and boulders, leaving very little room for error. After months of mapping, NASA selected a small crater called Nightingale. The usable sampling region was only about 8 meters across. OSIRIS-REx would have to descend autonomously toward this tiny target while comparing the terrain below with maps stored on board. One mistake could send the spacecraft into a boulder. Then came October 20th, 2020. OSIRIS-REx slowly descended toward Nightingale. At the end of its robotic arm was a circular sampling device called TAGSAM. The spacecraft approached at walking speed. Then it touched Bennu. For only a few seconds, a burst of nitrogen gas blasted into the surface, throwing rocks and dust into the collector. The surface reacted almost like a fluid. Rocks broke apart, material exploded outward, and the spacecraft immediately fired its thrusters and escaped. The entire event was captured by a camera on board OSIRIS-REx. When NASA examined the images after the maneuver, the team discovered a new problem. The collector was full, almost too full. Small particles of Bennu were visibly escaping through a gap in the sampling head. Instead of spending more time measuring exactly how much had been collected, engineers decided to protect what they already had. The robotic arm slowly moved the TAGSAM head into the return capsule. The material was locked inside. For the first time, NASA had secured a large, pristine sample collected directly from an asteroid. In May 2021, OSIRIS-REx left Bennu behind. For more than 2 years, it carried the sample toward Earth. Then, as the spacecraft approached our planet in September 2023, it released the return capsule. The capsule entered the atmosphere without an engine. A heat shield protected the material inside as it fell toward the desert. Then, the parachute opened. Minutes later, the capsule was sitting in Utah. Something collected more than 200 million miles from Earth had finally made it into human hands. The capsule was transported to NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. Inside a specially designed clean room, scientists began opening the collection hardware. And there was more material than expected. Dark dust and small rocks covered parts of the container. After the complete sample was processed, NASA measured 121.6 grams of Bennu material, more than twice the mission requirement. Most of it will not be used immediately. NASA plans to preserve a large portion for future scientists, using instruments that may not even exist yet. And this is where the story became much more interesting. Scientists began analyzing the chemistry inside Bennu. They found 14 of the 20 amino acids used by life on Earth to build proteins. They found all 5 nucleobases used in DNA and RNA. They also detected unusually high levels of ammonia. And minerals inside the sample showed evidence that salty liquid water once existed inside Bennu's ancient parent body. None of this means NASA found life, but the chemistry needed to eventually build biological systems was clearly present in material formed in the early solar system. Then, in late 2025, researchers announced another discovery. They had detected ribose and glucose in the Bennu samples. Ribose is particularly important because it forms part of the backbone of RNA. Combined with previously discovered nucleobases and phosphate, scientists had now identified all of the major molecular components needed to construct RNA within material from Bennu. Again, this is not evidence that life existed on the asteroid, but it strengthens an extraordinary possibility. Asteroids like Bennu may have delivered many of life's chemical ingredients to the young Earth billions of years ago. And scientists have only begun studying what NASA brought home. NASA went to Bennu looking for a piece of the early solar system. What it brought back may help explain how the ingredients for life reached Earth.